This is the 2023 Neil B. Freeman Lecture. This is one of several truly important co-curricular events we do each summer. Since this lecture was established 8 years ago, we've had a number of very prominent public intellectuals and accomplished individuals deliver this lecture, and tonight is no exception. Among those who've spoken in the past are Washington Post columnist George Will, Johan Nordberg, great young public intellectual from Sweden, Jose Piñera of Chile, Lawrence Reed, one of the past president of the Foundation for Economic Education. This lecture was established through the generous support of TFAS trustee emeritus Neil B. Freeman. Neil Freeman is a man of many accomplishments in his career. Journalist, entrepreneur, businessman, author, philanthropist, and award-winning television producer. He is the launcher of satellites, literally, when he served on the board of Comcast, and has been a leader of several major corporations, including the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. A Yale man, Neil has excelled in nearly every pursuit he's undertaken. As a television producer, he has produced more than 1,000 programs for national broadcast and has won many awards for journalistic excellence, including the George Foster Peabody Award and an Emmy. He's devoted much time to assisting others in their careers, not only through his work at the Fund for American Studies, serving on our board, but as a member of the White House Fellows Commission and many other capacities. Thanks to Neil Freeman, we're able to bring an outstanding individual to speak each summer. We look for people with skill who are skilled at oratory and can share ideas in inspired and creative ways to challenge us to think hard about how to enhance human dignity and human flourishing in the world. We're most grateful to Neil Freeman for his generous gift that enables this all-institute lecture. And I'm going to call on our academic director, Ann Bradley, who most of you know, to introduce our speaker this evening. Professor Bradley.
Good evening, everyone. It is really my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today. He has a very extensive and amazing bio and just a lot of life experiences, so we're really privileged to hear from him tonight. David L. Bahnsen is the founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, a national private wealth management firm with offices in Newport Beach, New York City, Bend, Nashville, Minneapolis, and Austin, so lots of places, managing over $4 billion in client assets. Prior to launching the Bahnsen Group, he spent 8 years as managing director at Morgan Stanley and 6 years as a vice president at UBS. He is consistently named one of the top financial advisors in America by Barron's, Forbes, and the Financial Times. He is a frequent guest on CNBC, Bloomberg, Fox News, and Fox Business, and is a regular contributor to National Review. He hosts the popular weekly podcast Capital Record, dedicated to a defense of free enterprise and capital markets. He is a regular lecturer for the Acton Institute and the Center for Cultural Leadership, and writes daily investment commentary at thedctoday.com and weekly macro commentary at dividendcafe.com. David is a founding trustee for Pacifica Christian High School of Orange County and serves on the board of directors for the National Review Institute in New York City. He is the author of several best-selling books, including Crisis of Responsibility, Our Cultural Addiction to Blame and How You Can Cure It, The Case for Dividend Growth, Investing in a Post-Crisis World. And his newest book, which I believe you're all receiving tonight, is There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths, which was released in November 2021. I'm really excited about that one. David's true passions include anything related to USC football, the financial markets, politics, and Chinese food. His ultimate passions are his wife of 20-plus years, Jolene, and their children, Mitchell, Sadie, and Graham, and the life they've created together on both coasts. David, welcome.
My life sounds so much more interesting when I hear it in a bio read from someone else versus when my kids describe me. I am very excited to be here tonight. I do want to thank the Fund for American Studies for this event, the invitation, and certainly the namesake behind the annual Neil B. Freeman Lecture. It's a very distinguished list of past speakers, a distinguished namesake behind the event. I'm humbled to have been invited. So I do understand you all will receive a copy of my book, There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths that she mentioned. I wrote that book the way I did, which was basically taking 250 quotes from various economic luminaries, many of which are deceased, some of which are still contemporary, and then on each page with accompanying their quote, added my own commentary. I wanted the various contributions of so many deceased people to capture the fundamental truths of economics, to capture cogent economic thought, using these great economic thinkers throughout history, because I believe that history contains the thought and tenets which validate the free market ideology that I am so passionate about. I'm all for new articulations, new arguments, new rebuttals, but in line with the biblical maxim that there's nothing new under the sun, I felt very strongly when I wrote the book that the wisdom of the masters in economic history was sufficient to make the case. So I use quotes from legends like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Jean-Baptiste Say, Karl Menger, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Joseph Schumpeter, Henry Hazlitt, Robert Mundell, and Milton Friedman, amongst others, to make the case for free enterprise and a commercial society, because I believe their core wisdom and primary mantras remain unimprovable in argument for the optimal conditions of human flourishing. Now, I included many contemporaries as well, disciples of many of these aforementioned people, McCloskey, Russ Roberts, Father Sirico, Dr. Sam Gregg, Art Laffer, Thomas Sowell, amongst others. I do believe in wisdom old and new, and much of the work from these living luminaries is vital in making the philosophical case I am dedicating my life to. But even their work is merely modern application of extremely time-tested principles. The history of classical economic thought is sufficient and robust. But it is important to allow for history to speak in a plethora of ways, not merely through the wisdom of classical ideas and principles. Ideas and principles get tested throughout history as well. We do not merely have to read or get to read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations to affirm that men and women acting in their own self-interest can optimally work with their fellow mankind to meet the needs of others, all the while having their own needs met. The economic growth of those nations who have allowed capital, labor, goods, and services to move across borders is a powerful exhibit. The enhanced economic vibrancy of societies that have dynamic divisions of labor with true specialization validates Smithian thought over and over again. Jean-Baptiste Say explained to us why economic growth must start with production. But the growth and prosperity in countries that are most productive is objectively verifiable. This was not just mere ideology on pages of his work. Over time, we've seen this validated in history. Likewise, countries that took Ricardo's law of comparative advantage to heart grew wealthier. Countries cut off from the strengths of other countries' natural resources did not. But it is not just the wisdom of the classical school that's been validated over time. 20th century battles over ideas. One side saying that central planning would better direct the affairs of mankind, while the other side asking where these central planners were, who had the knowledge to master plan a large, complex, and diverse economy. One side assured us that the enlightened skills of elites could optimize economic results, while the other side maintained that incentives matter, and disinterested third parties lacked not only the knowledge, but also the incentive to carry out this task. And of course, the most powerful forces of 20th century thought did not observe a limiting principle in advocating central planning. Their bloody and authoritarian pursuits of utopian ends allowed the world to see the real end results of Marxism, socialism, and totalitarian collectivism. Class struggle did not result in the worker overthrowing the entrepreneur. It resulted in the corruption and bloodshed of tyrants, leaving nations of the earth impoverished in every way imaginable. This is the history of ideas played out in real life, in real countries, in real societies, with real people, and now real results by which one can evaluate which ideas have delivered the goods. Once poor countries that have embraced market reform, liberty, self-interest, mutual cooperation, private property, and free exchange find themselves richer, their people happier, their futures brighter. On the other hand, well-resourced countries with bounty and plenty that went the other way saw their debt explode, their standard of living decline, and in many of the more extreme cases, their nations implode. Communism became the 20th century's blood-inked stain. On the other hand, freedom and enterprise did, in just decades, what had been unobtainable in millennia. The great enrichment brought unprecedented blessings to the West, but also to those corners of the earth that previously lacked basic sanitation, electricity, clean water, infrastructure, and other components of what we now associate with a decent civilization. Yet even that association carries a presupposition. Did civilizations become decent in possessing the basic modern amenities of plumbing, cleanliness, medicine, and nourishment by accident, or because of freedom? We only get to call our civilization civilized because we sleep under the blankets of freedom and prosperity. Our ideas gave birth to this enrichment and invited the nations of the earth along for the ride. Much work is still to be done, no doubt, but these basic facts cannot be negotiated away. Free markets brought billions of people out of poverty in the last 50 years. Opposition to free markets has killed or impoverished unspeakable amounts of people. I wish those two sentences could close the book on the entire debate. So is my purpose here just to spike the football in the name of free enterprise? Am I doing a 1990 celebration dance at the Berlin Wall, or taunting a Keynesian professor in a faculty lounge with a Gordon Gekko meme? Hardly. I hope you guys know who Gordon Gekko is. Maybe I need to culturally recontextualize. Hardly. For though history is clear in ideas and results, good ideas are sustained by men and women of courage, willing to continue in the intellectual and moral adventure that is necessary to continue breathing life into them. And my friends, I will argue that 2008 represented a historical moment in which defenders of the economic way of thinking were challenged and are challenged to this day to redraw from the wells of the masters. The ideas of Smith went toe-to-toe with Marx, and Smith won. Milton Friedman in the 1980s and 90s looked like Tom Brady, but the lessons of history became subject to re-litigation in the great financial crisis of 2008. The world's worst financial crisis since the Great Depression caused lifetime free marketeers to question the efficacy of markets. It made skeptics of believers, or at least pretend believers, the types who fail to put their principles in their briefcase each and every day, to borrow a metaphor I stole from Anne Bradley. Allow me to interject into my talk a moment of personal biography that will help color in my thesis that 2008 represented a paradigm shift, a historical challenge to market ideology. As she mentioned in my bio, my day job, my life's calling, I do serve as managing partner, chief investment officer of a $4.5 billion wealth management firm. And I believe that you cannot have capitalism without capital markets. I believe capital markets serve at the crux of free enterprise, bringing ideas, risk-taking, innovation, productive activity to life. The financial markets of America's market economy animate me, fascinate me, inspire me. I work each and every day at harnessing our capital markets as a tool towards creating outcomes for real people who have real goals and need real solutions. I've worked in this space for 25 years, intend to work in it until they carry me out. I wish for all of you a career that fulfills you as mine has fulfilled me, but not merely financially or materially, but ontologically, meaning to the core of your being. May you never seek out a line of work where your sole objective is to do it so you will not have to do it one day anymore. May more of us die in our offices. Which, by the way, is my next book coming out in February. It's called Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. And I think finally I found a book that will make some people really mad at me. Been working on it for a long time. I bring this up because my thesis that a post-2008 world is retesting the lessons of history as it pertains to freedom and markets is more than just academic for me. I spent those years of the great financial crisis working as a managing director inside Morgan Stanley, one of the largest firms on Wall Street. Most of history's profound moments I have merely studied. But 9/11 and the great financial crisis I lived through, the latter by profound professional connection. My experience in the actual moments of 2008 was that there was very little time for deep thought and reflection. Policymakers, most of which I assume were well-intentioned, were plugging the holes in the dam of credit markets that had imploded. Individuals assessed the reality of decimated home values, declining 401k values, potentially lost jobs, declining wages, shuttered businesses, and all the other things that come from the pain of a debt deflation spiral and bust. The actual causation of the crisis was immaterial to almost everyone. A bomb had gone off and people needed to run for safety. Eventually, there was time for some sober reflection on what had happened and what could be done to prevent it in the future. But that conversation was led by politicians, those whose electoral efforts were contingent upon telling voters that they had fixed something. Banks associated with free markets failed. Wall Street, associated with free markets, was in disarray. Asset prices associated with free markets collapsed. The Occam's razor explanation for the media, for the political class, and eventually for academia was that free markets had failed. Debating if I want to say this or not. Usually when I go off script and say something, I get in trouble, so I'm going to do it. When we say that for the political class, the media, the pop culture, free markets became the scapegoat, I just want to add that no less than a lifetime free marketeer as the head of our central bank at the time, Alan Greenspan, and the President of the United States at the time, who in a lot of ways I hold in very high regard as a person, George W. Bush, explicitly said so, explicitly used the words, the free market failed. If the 1980s and 90s were touchdown moments for free marketeers, the years that followed 2008 were like having those touchdowns taken off the scoreboard by instant replay. But only this time, the instant replay was wrong. The officials were wrong. The need of the hour was for fans to scream like bloody hell over what they saw clear as could be on the Jumbotron. Because, my friends, markets did not fail in 2008. And those now re-exploring the testimony of history that free markets deliver better outcomes than central planning are missing the most important ingredient of this subject, humanity. Human action, the human person. Markets consist of human beings. Two people on a desert island cooperating to make the fruit supply last are a market. And so are millions of people seeking optimal mortgage finance for their residential real estate aspirations. But at the core of these markets are still human beings with incentives, with consequences, doing economic calculation, and living with the results. Humans who have needs and wants and can only have their needs and wants met by meeting the needs and wants of others. Hayek told us that the fatal conceit of central planning is the idea that man can shape the world around him according to his wishes. Collectivism's fatal conceit is not merely the idea that a central planner should optimally organize society, but that the central planner even could do so. But the fatal conceit of those on the right, often those who argue in defense of a market economy, as I do, is to ever do so on the basis of efficiency or data alone, to do so divorced from humanity. At the foundation of our case for markets must be the human person, human beings who seek a better life, who seek conditions for prosperity and well-being, who achieve greater things when they are free, when they can earn the rewards of their efforts, but yes, also suffer the setbacks of miscalculation. Humanity can never grow if it cannot be made to feel pain, disappointment, rejection, or loss. The decisions you will make in your life that will bear the most fruit will come out of lessons sometimes learned the hard way. Entrepreneurs do not intuitively know all elements of production capacity, consumer demand, or other variables necessary to the success of their operation. Indeed, whole societies make mistakes at times and come out of those mistakes stronger, resilient, even anti-fragile. What system of thought, what philosophical and economic worldview most facilitates gains because it most encourages the risk-taking that generates both loss and gain is free enterprise. And it does this not by seeking to soften the pain of tough decisions, but by leaning into those lessons, by appreciating the spontaneous order of our lives, by recognizing that the human person is a special, God-created, dignified, rational, and moral being. Humanity is not an amorphous collective of people who merely form the data sets out of which a central planner issues correctives. This was the flaw of people's understanding in 2008. They believed it was aggregated mortgage default data, aggregated subprime numbers, aggregated GDP loss, when in fact, at the core of the great financial crisis was unbelievable human error and, yes, unbelievable policy error, but nevertheless, both economic and moral mistakes. Only free enterprise appreciates the soul of commerce more than its spreadsheets. The allocation of scarcity and social organization that goes with free enterprise is what we are talking about when we discuss economics. Free enterprise challenges us to think about that process in terms of the object and the subject of our endeavors, that when we pursue division of labor, specialization, free exchange, incentives to produce, private property and its attendant rights, and a celebration of the commercial activity that will come from humanity pursuing goods and services that enhance quality of life. We are pursuing a deeper happiness for humanity. This brings me to the last word of my speech title, happiness. I believe, by the way, in the most basic of senses, if I'm drilling down into this, happiness is a decision we make, usually contingent upon how we respond to various circumstances. But in a deeper and more existential sense, we're really talking about this concept I call human flourishing, a material and spiritual contentment, satisfaction, joy, abundance, and peace. Free markets have not merely been judged by history to be better arbiters of risk and reward than alternative systems. Free markets have not merely been revealed as a better allocator of scarce resources. Free enterprise has most fed the yearnings of the soul of mankind to not be forced into work on the family farm if what they seek is something different, to not live a life of desolation or alienation, or one of the worst experiences humanity can suffer, deploying your activities for commercial use outside of any passion or even any skill. In free enterprise, we aim for the flourishing that comes from marrying our passions to our skills and not accepting a level station in life if we do not want to. Humanity is diverse. That diversity means something so much richer than just race, gender, and class. In a market economy, it means the diversity of happiness, different visions for what happiness means, different sources of happiness, different visions for how to get there. And I can think of no greater argument for a free and virtuous society than the pursuit of the happiness it unleashes. Markets cannot heal all that weighs on humanity. But a collapse of markets, interventions to markets, and undermining of markets can all put a lot of weight on that which plagues us. What we must ask of our markets is the pursuit of happiness, the aspirational society, the economic miracle that comes from humanity unleashed. We stifle happiness when we stifle the potential of humanity. And what history has taught us is that markets unleash humanity's potential. History is on your side, my friends. Humanity's happiness depends on us not reversing its lessons. Thank you very much.
We're going to go ahead and open up to Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, we have microphones here and microphones here. So don't be shy. Give it a try. Come on up.
So I really love Q&A. Before the first question comes, I'll say something. You can ask me about anything you want. I love just going off the cuff. I give an awful lot of speeches, and sometimes I script them all out as I did tonight's, and other times I'm just kind of going off of notes. So I really wanted a particular message there, but for this Q&A, you can just let it fly. And if you stump me, then I'm just going to run out the door and you'll never see me again. All right, let's do it.
All right, great. Thank you for the speech. Interesting stuff. You've talked a lot about the dichotomy between central planning and free market, but to me this seems to a certain extent a discussion of a Cold War era dichotomy, but there's a whole spectrum. A market can be unregulated, can be slightly regulated, or there can be no market at all. You've talked a lot about the financial crisis and the role of the financial sector in it. To me, it seems that there were certain biases present in the financial market where the functioning of the market led to an exacerbation and the creation of the crisis. Now, I'm not
Say that last
arguing
sentence again for me, please.
that there are certain biases present in the market, human biases, because a market is a coordination mechanism for humans, and humans are biased, so the biases of humans, they enter into the market functioning. So it is not to say that markets are bad, but there might be biases present in a market, which, when unregulated, can cause crises such as we saw in 2008. In light of this, how would you say that proper regulation of financial markets should be oriented to prevent these systemic biases present in markets?
I appreciate the question. So I'm on this lab, right? So I don't need to pretend I'm talking to this thing. Is that right? Okay. Can I ask you a question? What do you think was the failure of regulation in 2008? The various human biases that exist in markets that I would argue are anthropologically unavoidable. Right? Humans have biases. I think biases can change. I don't think that regulators lack biases. I don't think that that statement is an argument for or against any particular view of a market economy, but that people, humans, have biases, I totally agree with. But the next step of what you did with that sentence was to go to a deregulatory causation thesis in the 2008 crisis. And so I'm wondering, what was the part that was insufficiently regulated in 2008?
Well, I'm not going to let myself get bogged down into technical details, but in my
Even just at a high level.
in my mind, it is financial markets are prone to panic.
Yeah.
So as soon as some bank thinks, oh, this is going to go south, they're gonna, keep their money in a place, take less risk. You get a credit crunch. Suddenly, all banks are unwilling to deal with each other.
Right.
You get a huge panic. Nobody's willing to lend to each other. The whole financial system dries up, and everybody is in a lot of trouble.
So your explanation there is 100% accurate. It had a lot to do with what happened, a lot of bank failures in the Great Depression, and a lot to do with what happened to bank failures about 4 months ago. It had absolutely nothing to do with what happened in 2008. And so I want to get to the real thrust of your question, which is where I believe in a regulatory propriety in financial markets. But I do think it's very important that pretextually we not wrongly understand 2008. 2008 financial markets were so abundantly and excessively regulated that one of the great ironies of my critique of post-2008 commentary is that it is not used as a huge argument against regulation. Working in financial services, we deal with hundreds of different regulators, an alphabet soup of different regulators. Almost anything that happened in 2008 was under the purview of regulators. And of course, they've doubled down on a lot of regulation. In fact, just yesterday, I saw Senator Warren get really mad that someone had violated some of the rules of Dodd-Frank that they passed to avoid future financial panics. And what was the rule that she was mad about? A bank was charging too high of overdraft fees when they were bouncing checks. Now, do you think that's what caused the financial crisis? See, this is the problem with biases, is that regulators out of financial crisis, where you could not have had a normal bank panic in 08. You had a real capital insolvency. It was not a liquidity crisis that panicked. Lehman Brothers literally had blown up capital. Bear Stearns literally had blown up capital. So there was not merely a crisis of confidence. There was a crisis of solvency that was only going to be dealt with by liquidating bad assets and moving on to a better allocation of resources. But what did the regulators do in that moment? They harnessed the courage to pass rules against overdraft fees, debit card points. So this, to me, is the critique I have of the premise that some of the bad things that happen in life can be addressed by a better regulatory apparatus, when it seems to me so often that regulatory apparatus is either non-productive or, in fact, counterproductive. But I do not agree with the premise that one's belief in free markets contra central planning is a view for totally non-regulated markets. I do believe it's a plea for limiting principles. And that is the title of my book, which I obviously stole from Milton Friedman. He had an article called No Free Lunch. And the earliest finding we can have of where that title, that expression had been used, there's no such thing as a free lunch, was a newspaper article in El Paso, Texas in the, I think, late 1930s. But all it means is just a kind of cute way of saying that economics is about trade-offs. And my view is that when we invite a regulation, we should bias towards a limited regulation, recognizing that any regulation we have invites a trade-off. And we may view that trade-off as worthwhile. We may view that trade-off as something that the cost-benefits analysis rules in favor of the regulation. But in a system that biases central planning without counting the cost of regulation, I think you end up with not only non-productive, but counterproductive regulatory environment. Financial systems are more subject to panic, and I could go on all night about why we've made that worse in our country with the role we've given the Federal Reserve. I think we've deified the central bank in a way that has told every rational person that there will be booms and busts, and they should go play the game accordingly. And I think that's a very bad thing for our society. But I do not believe that what I am advocating for philosophically is for no regulation of financial markets, but I am arguing for principles that define and set the regulations, and my principles are primarily limited to rule of law. And I believe that in Daveland, if we were to sort of harness the various philosophical influences I've had in the great study of economics, from the classical school to the Austrian to Chicago school to where we stand here today, and we were to assemble some form of a financial system and evaluate what the regulatory apparatus would be, I think you'd have a much higher cost of capital in Daveland, because we would let creditors take losses. They don't ever want anyone to take a loss. And that's what this whole system's about, is avoiding loss. So we have a choice to make. We could either go have more regulation on debit card fees and allow risk takers to not suffer losses and continue rinsing and repeating this boom-bust cycle, or we can move to Dave land. I thought that was funny. Well, I hope I answered your question to some degree. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Very thoughtful.
Thank you.
What school are you from, by the way? Thank you very much for your question. I really appreciate it. All right.
Hi there. Thank you for being here. My name is Joseph. I'm from Northwest Nazarene University. My question kind of goes off of the 2008 financial crisis when the Fed kept rates artificially low. Do you think it's appropriate for the U.S. to have a central bank that has a monopoly on the money supply and the ability to influence interest rates?
Okay. That's a great question for me to make nobody happy with whatsoever, but I'm willing to do it. It would be like being back at home with my wife and kids. No, I do believe in a role of a central bank, which makes me a little bit on the outside of many of my fellow free market friends. But once I define what I mean by a central bank, most of them get a little more comfortable with what I mean. And so then the next part of your question was, do I think they should control the money supply? I do not, but I also, in fairness, they don't. Okay, so Congress has, there's a meaningful sense in which Treasury is more behind money supply, if you actually mean money supply in a technical sense. But do I think the Fed should be influencing interest rates? And I think that to the extent that my vision of the central bank is to be merely a lender of last resort, I think there's a sort of Hamiltonian consistency to what I'm advocating, and I think events of the late 19th century argued for a lender of last resort, that in basically what he was referring to when liquidity crises become solvency crises. To have a central bank there as that lender who lent at burdensome interest rates backed by very good collateral. I do not think that that is inappropriate or illegitimate. Some of my free market friends disagree with me. But that is such a humble role and different role for the Fed than what we live with, that what I just said is sort of unrecognizable in a modern context. So I will just ask you, should the Fed, when you talk about interest rates, should they set interest rates? It's another way of saying what? Should they set the price of money? But see, they can't set the price of money. That's the problem I have, is again, not them doing something they shouldn't do, doing something they can't do. How do I know what the cost of capital should be? Well, how do I know what this bottle of water should cost? What is the basic tenet of price discovery? Buyer and seller cooperation. I have every confidence in the world that borrowers and lenders can set the price of capital. And so for the Fed to do it as an instrumentation of policy stability has obviously not worked. They've exacerbated boom-bust cycles for my entire adult lifetime. And I think that the flaw is not bad intentions on their part. It's not a conspiracy vision of the Fed. I think the flaw is that they're being asked to do something they cannot do. I hope that's helpful. Great question. Okay.
So hello, and thank you for coming. My name is Ethan, and I'm from Denison University. My question goes back to your speech, in that you mentioned that capitalism cannot function without capital markets. For those of us who aren't well versed in economics, what do you mean by capital markets? And can you elaborate on your point that capitalism cannot function without them?
Yeah, first, I swear I'll do this in 20 seconds. I put that line in there because I wanted to draw out the point that capital markets are necessary in a free enterprise system, and capitalism and capital markets allowed me to use the same word there in that way. But I really hate the word capitalism. And so I'm just going to get my hobby horse out of the way. Capitalism is a Marxian construction of a free enterprise ideology. The ism that animates me was what I talked about tonight regarding humanity, the human person, their pursuit of flourishing, of a good life, and the happiness that I think can come from that. And capitalism implies that our be-all, end-all is the capital itself. I think it's a tool towards free enterprise, but ultimately I prefer that our vernacular not borrow from Marx, and I think luminaries like Smith and so forth would agree with me. But what I mean by capital markets or financial markets are necessary to a free enterprise system is the fact that we are talking about free enterprise as the exchange of goods and services, the production of goods and services. You can't exchange what isn't produced, to meeting different needs. meeting different wants. And so there are humans out there who want something, presumably to enhance the quality of life. And those things have to be produced. And so when you look at labor that goes into it, land that may go into it, capital which is necessary to finance parts, labor, hire labor, finance these types of things, a capital market becomes more complex when you talk about equity and debt and various conventions and evolutions and innovations in these markets. American financial markets are incredibly robust. We have the ability, venture capital, Silicon Valley, to go raise a ton of money for a company that has never made a thing, made a dollar, and is just spending money hand over fist. We have the ability to take a company that is up and running, is kind of suffering a little bit, needs an infusion of cash, can't go to public markets, it's too risky for a bank, and we have a private equity system that can fund some of that. We have mom and pop banks that can go fund their local farmer. We have big banks that can go fund a larger business that has cash flows they can collateralize. And then we have private lenders, non-bank lenders that are trillions of dollars. These are all innovations of a truly robust financial system. Alexander Hamilton would be smiling ear to ear, not just because they made a musical about him. So that's what I mean by capital markets. At a simplistic level, it's our ability to use debt and equity to drive free enterprise. At a more complex level, it's the stuff I do all day long, ways in which we use our capital markets as a tool to advancing human flourishing. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right, we'll come back over here.
Hello, my name is Liz Cardoza, and I'm a student at Drury University. Is the microphone picking up?
I don't think so. Go again.
Hello?
Yeah, they got you now.
All right, my name is Liz Cardoza. I am a student at Drury University, and I'm in the Leadership in the American Presidency track for TFAS. I'm curious, most of what we've been talking about involves how bipartisanship is prerequisite to any progress being made. You've also made comments about how you've finally written a book that will get people mad, and you didn't include one of the book titles, which was about how Warren is trying to end the middle class. What do you see as your role in reducing divisive rhetoric and helping with bipartisanship in current politics?
Yeah, so I wrote a book about Elizabeth Warren during the campaign in 2020, and the reason that book didn't make anyone mad is because her campaign imploded, and so no one ever had to read the book. If she had been the nominee for the Democratic Party, I think that book would have sold 100,000 copies, and I would have definitely made some people mad, but I never got the chance to, because although I really stand behind everything I wrote in the book, she was the front runner when my publisher contracted me to write the book, and she went from like 60% in the polls to, by the time the book came out, kind of collapsing, and at that point, the 2020 Democratic nomination went a different direction. And so thank you for noticing that book, and maybe you were one of the 43 people that bought it. But no, I do believe that subtitle about the Elizabeth Warren policy portfolio destroying the middle class, I think I'm really understating what I really believe there. I think that she is anti-billionaire, pro-millionaire candidate, which is what I think most of left-wing, crony Democratic, left-wing, that particular ilk of an environmental agenda, forgiving the student debt of people that are higher earners in society than lower earners, not forgiving credit card debt of low earners, but student debt of high earners, forgiving, or even just the subsidies she would give to very, very well-heeled, very well-financed by American capital markets, green energy companies, things of that nature. I think it has the net effect of really hollowing out the middle class. This has happened in so many blue cities in America. So people could agree or disagree with that. Obviously, I would need to elaborate a lot more to defend that position, but people could agree or disagree with that thesis, but that's the net effect of where I'm trying to go. As far as the notion of bipartisanship and just the general tenor of conversation, I don't know that you could have someone up here who agrees more with the notion that civility and a particular tenor that we do not have now is desperately needed. And so my own politics about these things are very, very surprising to people. I am a lifetime movement conservative who's mostly voted Republican. It's very possible in the near future I'll change registration outside Republican to something more independent, because I feel very strongly that both parties should work to get certain things done. But I don't have a problem with there being a real battle of ideas. And I think that some of the great things that have gotten done, again, mostly in my lifetime, I'm not going back to the duels of Jefferson and Burr and the debates that were far different and more complex over different parts of American history. But in a more modern context, I think when you look to Reagan and Tip O'Neill when I was a much younger person, and certainly Gingrich and Clinton when I was a young adult, I think that those were primarily battles of ideas, and then they had to build coalitions and do politics to get stuff done. And I think that's the right way to do it, and I do not look favorably upon the current tribalization that has taken place in American political life.
So may
Is
I
there a
ask
follow-up?
follow-up? Yes. If you're looking to avoid tribalism and looking to imitate Reagan, why would you look to write a book that would make people mad?
Oh, that was a joke. I don't really want to make people mad. I'm sorry if you thought I was serious about that.
Why would something be, I didn't understand the titling of that book, as it seemed like it would divide people more rather than presenting a unifying set of ideas.
I think that's a fair point. I do respectfully disagree. I don't think that title was very inflammatory, but I can respect that some may have felt that way. What was the subtitle of Elizabeth Warren, how she would destroy the middle class American? I mean, these days it's pretty tame. But we can respectfully disagree on that if you'd like.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Charlotte from St. Olaf College. You mentioned a lot in your speech about your experiences during the 2008 financial crisis and how they solidified your perspective on markets. And I was just wondering if, maybe this is really difficult, but if you had to pick one thing from your experiences, was there anything that changed your perspective on markets?
On markets, no. I think that I was fortunate. By the time the 2008 crisis came, I was not still developing my first principles. I think that I had, over the 25, 30 years prior to that, really gone through an evolution of developing my belief system, my worldview. And so in terms of the tenets of markets, just to simplistically answer, I don't think things happened in the financial crisis that impacted my view of markets. I think significant things impacted my understanding of humanity and of reality. I think that many people default to a sort of conspiratorial view of what's happening out there because I think people feel comfort in thinking that there are evil people plotting the affairs of what's going on. And I think if people could have sat in on some of the meetings I sat in on, Morgan Stanley and the Fed, Treasury, they would not have a very high view of their ability to be holding the world on their strings. I think it was chaos. I think it was incompetence. I think that it dramatically impacted my understanding of the way the adult world really works.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, sorry.
They'll get you. I think there's a little delay as they switch sides.
Hi, I am Ethan Avery from the University of Mississippi, and I just wanted to note something and ask for a bit of clarification. You made a lot of references to spirituality and the nature of humans as God created as an integral part of the market.
In fairness, I made one, but yes, I would have made a lot more, but you're right, I made one.
As a non-religious individual, do you think a spiritual framework is required to be an integral part of the market? Or is that just where you're coming from as a spiritual person?
No, I don't agree that there are non-religious or non-spiritual people. And so if one has a very high degree of religious conviction around an a-religiosity, I still think logically and philosophically my point holds. I think people have a belief system, they have convictions, they'll operate on them, and that they influence what they believe about right and wrong, and they influence what they believe about reality. And so a sort of philosophical construction, one may choose, I presume this is what you mean, to divorce it from a deity. I don't accept that the definition of religion requires one to believe in a deity. I obviously do. But no, I think that every economic view that I would entangle with, favorably or unfavorably, I think has religious presuppositions behind it.
On this, we can respectfully disagree. Thank you for
very
your
much.
time.
Appreciate it. All right, other side.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Great. My name's Elena. I'm from the University of Michigan. And I had a very generalized question, but for the sake of brevity, you can only address like maybe one part of it. So I think it's been very clear that millennials and Gen Z have faced a lot of financial like obstacles in their early careers that might impact their ability to hit milestones such as buying houses, that sort of thing, like raising inflation, higher cost of living, all that sort of things. What would you think? I don't know if you've had any thoughts on this, but
Oh, yeah.
do you have any ideas for how to approach these problems with a market-based solution?
I certainly do. I think that the majority of the things that you're describing, I believe, were created by bad policy. And so for a free market guy like me, do not identify as a libertarian, I do believe in removing bad policies to create better outcomes. Ironically, I have stated this I'm right smack dab in the middle of Gen X. I'm 49 years old, the most underrated generation. And I talk to baby boomers, Generation X people all the time, and they will tell me how just absolutely despondent they are. Their kids, their grandkids have gone off to college. They've been heavily influenced by far left progressives, and they've just now abandoned markets. And they quote the stats that 52% identify as socialist or 45% identify as hostile to market, whatever the number of the week is. And I always say, I just want to remind you what age they were in 2008, what they were observing with mom and dad with their house and their 401k and what was happening in the global economic system. And then now they, let's say, presumably went on to college. Maybe they didn't go to college, or they developed a skill. They've gotten gainfully employed. And the incredible reward that our society has given them is student debt that was one of the biggest ripoffs in human history and the total inability to afford a home. So I have this fight all the time that with people on the right and left, that the notion that a permanently escalating value of a home above and beyond real natural market forces is an abomination. And Milton Friedman joked about this in the 1970s on a thing you probably all, I mean, I know some of my friends in the front row would know, but many probably never heard of the Phil Donahue show. But Milton Friedman said, people love inflation when it's their house. It's when they're at the grocery store buying goods and services they don't like inflation. So I do not believe Gen Z will be facing high consumer price inflation for a very long time. But the bad news is it's because I think they're going to face something far worse, which is economic stagnation that I refer to as Japanification, where our continued use of fiscal and monetary policy to intervene in the course of free markets puts downward pressure on growth. And that's what I think Gen Z has largely inherited, is an economy that is running at half of its 70-year average of economic growth for the last 15 years. For 15 years, we've been running at half of our economic growth. And so what would I do to go about fixing that? If I got going on what I think about the student loan market and the overall university system, I'd be here all night, which I'm happy to do. But that would be a very, very low-hanging fruit to change the world. And then I most certainly believe that Federal Reserve interventions to put downward pressure on borrowing for homes, various zoning restrictions that artificially constrain new supply, environmental regulations that make it impossible to get adequate housing built where there is demand. I think these things are unforgivable and need to change. And then, of course, there's a whole host of other issues about vocational programs, trade schools, different things like that. I do believe in a robust policy portfolio that Gen Z would like quite a bit. But I think that first starts with admitting that so much of the problem we have was caused by horrifically bad policy.
Thank you for that thoughtful response.
I'll do these quick. I'll do them quick. I'm good. All right. My flight's not till 8 in the morning.
Good evening. Thank you for coming out.
Name and school.
John Hudden, Augustana College. You said in discussing your new book that one should not be afraid of dying at their desk. May you elaborate on this?
Well, I wrote a whole book on it, and so you're happy to pre-order it on Amazon.com and post. In all seriousness, I'd be happy to send you one, but just to real quickly answer, the tenet of the book, Full-Time Work in the Meaning Life, is that we are right now suffering through a societal crisis of alienation, isolation, loneliness, increased unhappiness, despair, and I believe that we talk all the time as if one of the big problems we have is people working too much. And I just think it's completely back-asswards. people are not working enough, that people have gotten away from a real identity with their vocation, a real calling with their career. And I think that that is what the book is fundamentally about, is me theologically, economically, and ontologically arguing for a higher regard for work as dignifying the human person.
Thank you, sir.
You're very welcome. All right, here we go.
Hello.
Rapid fire.
Hi, my name is Cam. I go to the University of Indiana, or Indiana University. I'd preface this by saying I believe in and support free markets, but I think it's important to play devil's advocate sometimes. How do you feel like the argument that markets are good, but people are susceptible to erroneous and immoral behavior differs from the argument from the other side that, like, you know, command economy or like socialist systems are good, but people, it hasn't been executed because people are susceptible to immoral or...
See, I agree with both premises completely. And so this is such a great setup for a case for markets, that because I believe in the flaws of human nature and in the capacity for wickedness, for selfishness, for fraud, corruption, the question I have to answer is what system will most facilitate the things we want to have, because I don't accept nirvana or utopia as a potential outcome on this side of glory. And so post-fall, because again, I'm speaking as obviously a man informed by religious convictions, because I believe this thing called sin entered the world, I believe that we have sin that will exist in markets, because all I think a market is you and I transacting. And so there's a capacity for sin. So my question is, what will further organize society? You and I having the freedom to engage together, where if I do wrong to you, my reputation in the community suffers and my ability to continue meeting my own needs suffers, or a system led by powerful elites that are just as sinful as us. So it's not a question of bad capacity or no bad capacity. It's a question of, do you want it in the hands of Pol Pot, or do you want it in the hands of you and me? I pick you and me. But then further, the great contribution of Hayekian thought in the 20th century was that the government, first of all, we already know they don't have the incentives. They do not have skin in the game to the profit or loss of economic decision making. So inviting their role in is already constricted by the fact that they're just simply not stakeholders in the transaction. But what Hayek pointed out was they also don't have the knowledge because of how widely dispersed knowledge is in the society. And that's the fundamental thing that I know as a businessman, what he called in his brilliant essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society, time and place circumstance. I know that you and I, on a local level, have the ability to make decisions that are better than someone here in this beautiful city could. That would be my answer, is that there's an improved system dealing with the knowledge problem and incentives in markets. But in both systems, we're dealing with the reality of greed and corruption. And I think markets have proven, through the testimony of history, to be a far better arbiter and constraint on those tendencies than statism or central planning.
Appreciate you.
Over here.
I'm Carter from...
Now this guy's got the last question, so the pressure's really on over here. He's got to rev up. Go ahead, Carter.
Pressure on me then, I guess. I'm Carter from Kansas State University. What are your thoughts on the government's economic handling of COVID, specifically the Fed printing money to keep markets and afloat and business shutdowns across the country?
Yeah, so there's a lot in there, and they're all kind of connected. I think that without getting into all of the medical side of it, but just you're asking me specifically on the policy side, I mean, I was a fervent opponent of the lockdowns, and to the extent that there were going to be various lockdowns, I would have wanted each and every last one of them to be at a local level. I'm a huge believer in federalism and subsidiarity. I think that the prior administration failed miserably in allowing for DC to set the policy across the whole country. And what we now know medically more or less just delayed the inevitable, that viral reality was going to spread, and the sooner it did, the sooner the thing would be over. So I think they made a big mistake, some of which was well-intentioned, some of which was not. But then in the aftermath of that, because I really don't want to get into all of the medical side, I think that basically we failed to bring our principles to the crisis. So I did a Zoom near the beginning of COVID with Robert Sirico, the founder of the Acton Institute, and we were talking back and forth about this with all the people around the country or whatever listening, and he said something that stuck with me to this day. Principles are something you have to have well before a crisis. They are not something you develop at a crisis. And so there are certain parts of government intervention that I would have supported. And there are certain parts that were obviously so devoid of any limiting principle and any thoughtful application of principle that I would not support. I think that the monetary element you draw, because I want to go back to my speech about 2008. What happened in COVID was not about COVID, it was about 2008. The Fed took a hyper-aggressive stance to treating the problems of a debt deflation spiral in 2008, and they felt they got away with it, and so it wasn't even controversial what Chairman Powell was doing in 2020. There was absolutely no pushback about the idea of going back to the zero bound, of now holding that zero rate from March of 2020 all the way until May of 2022, over 2 years of 0% when the economy had been reopened for over a year and a half. How much that distorted housing prices, how much that was unfair to Gen Z for the affordability boom that gave housing prices. I think those things were all fatal errors by policymakers in the COVID moment.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, grand finale.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Christoph Meisen. I go to the University of Passau in Germany. And I was about to ask you something about the lost decade in Latin America in the 1980s, but I think that goes so far. So
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you another question. Do you think market forces alone are able to successfully combat climate change? If so, why? If not, what sort of government regulation would you advocate for? I'm thinking about, for example, a very market-oriented government regulation would be the EU's emission certificate trading system, in which private companies are able to allocate CO2 emissions and set the price on their own, and the supply of those certificates is simply set by the EU. So what do you think about those sort of regulations?
My view of climate regulations, and my view of financial regulations that I think our first question asker asked, and if we had time for more Q&A, if someone were to ask me about a view of regulations in any other context, financials are important, climate issues are important, but my answers will not vary. That I want our approach to regulations to start with a nod to limiting principles, to the understanding that there will be trade-offs. Climate regulations are themselves somewhat fascinating to me because of the fact that by definition, like in other words, if we're trying to protect the American financial system, in theory, if there's a bank in China not following American financial regulation, it produces no contagion risk to America. And yet, by definition, climate regulations are somewhat interesting in that very few who favor a heavy regulatory environment for climate in America seem all that concerned about the fact that China and India are not interested in what we do. And so I do believe that the trade-offs have to be understood, and that thus far, I see basically three major issues that are abundantly clear to me as this debate is heated up, no pun intended, in America. One is that people seem to approach it with a favorability towards regulations with no regard at all for trade-offs. That there is not a serious, earnest attempt to understand what we're asking others to give up and for what benefit. Oftentimes, I think it's good that they don't, because they would end up having to affirm that there's no benefit whatsoever. It's cosmetic and virtue signaling on the cheap. Second, that some of the things that have clearly moved the needle in terms of carbon emission are most rejected. And that to the extent I believe a greater use of natural gas, which is a cleaner fuel at terms of emissions of carbon than coal, that I remain somewhat mystified why the regulatory class does not favor, why it continues to favor such harsh restrictions on use of natural gas versus coal based on their premises that they're bringing to the subject, not even premises I may bring. And then third, I think, is the issue with a regulatory environment that is trying to do what I think you were talking about the EU is doing, blending some form of freedom in exploration of new products and applications, and involving the state and how it is how the cost structure is formed. And that particular one you mentioned, I haven't studied in depth. I'd be very happy to do. But again, the philosophical framework I would bring is that there would be a trade-off, and I would wonder what a disinterested third party is doing to benefit the end run. And there very well may be an answer. You know, I certainly believe in regulatory limits within various elements of climate policy. but I would not want to write a blank check for that without fully understanding who the stakeholders were and what exactly the regulations were. And I had confessed to a bias against something that involves the state collecting a fee when I thought our intention here was to improve the environment.
Thank you.
All right, Roger. I'd try to.
All right, I need that. Thank you very much, David Bahnsen. I said at the beginning, we'd be getting things to think hard about, ideas to think hard about that challenge us, and ideas tied to human dignity and human flourishing. So I hope this causes conversations tonight in the dorms and on the metros going home and throughout the next few weeks, because I think there are important things for us all to think about that were said tonight. Thank you for the eloquent remarks, and thank you for taking all those great questions and handling them so very well. You are going to get a copy of his latest book on your way out, the one, There's No Free Lunch. Pick one up on your way out. Look through it tonight and in the next few weeks. It's really great stuff in there, great commentary. Let's one more time thank David Bahnsen for coming out from California to do that. Travel safely. Have a good day tomorrow and a great weekend. Thank you.